Hi, I'm Anne Regimbal, and I'm glad you can join me today for exploring the Stations of the Cross and four of the people who figure in them. I'm the author of Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross, a new book just released in April of 2020 on Amazon, Apple iBooks, and many other book platforms. Today, we're going to discuss four of the people who figure in the Stations of the Cross: Pontius Pilate, Simon of Cyrene, Veronica and her famous veil, and Joseph of Arimathea, and the Holy Grail. I hope you'll enjoy this and feel that at the end, you know a little bit more about those people so that they come to life for you the next time you pray the stations. So let's start with Pontius Pilate, the man who condemns Jesus to death. Now, if you look right here on the right, you'll see what is the actual first station of the cross on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem today. Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross includes photos of all 14 of the stations in Jerusalem so that you can see what the real stations actually look like. I hope you enjoy that part of the book. It's very interesting. Now, this first one, the Church of the Condemnation. The church was erected on the site of what was believed to be the Praetorium. The Praetorium is the place the Bible tells us that Pilate tried Jesus. Now, where was that? The term Praetorium actually means a military general's tent, and there was nothing really like that in Jerusalem at that time. That's why many people think, because of the military association, that it was probably the Antonia fortress. That was where the Roman garrison in Jerusalem was housed. Pontius Pilate didn't actually live in Jerusalem. He lived in the beautiful coastal city of Caesarea Maritima, and in a few minutes, I'll show you what that city looked like. So when he came to Jerusalem, where did he stay? No one knows for sure, but there was a chance that he stayed with the Roman legions at the Antonia fortress. One person who believed this very much was a woman named Helena, who we subsequently call St. Helen. In fact, the famous volcano in Washington state, Mount St. Helens, is named in her honor. She was the mother of the Roman Emperor Constantine. And it was Constantine in the 4th century that actually legalized Christianity. Helena had been a practicing Christian even before this happened. And she, at the age of 76, I love this woman, decided to go to Jerusalem and try to find all the sites that related to the story of Jesus. She wanted to find the place of the crucifixion. She wanted to find Jesus's tomb and the Holy Cross. And so her son, Constantine, who was the emperor, gave her an entire legion of Roman soldiers to go with her to Jerusalem. While she was there, one of the things she found were these. These are now called the Scala Sancta, and they're found in Rome. But they were the actual steps up the Antonia fortress in Jerusalem. Helena believed that these were the steps that Jesus would have walked up on his way to his trial before Pontius Pilate. And so she had her legion of soldiers take these steps away from the Antonia fortress, put them on a boat, sail them across the Mediterranean, and today you'll see them in Rome, very close to St. John's Labyrinth. What you'll also observe, as you do here, is that pilgrims to Rome ascend the steps praying on their knees because of the belief that these were the same steps that Jesus walked up before his trial before Pontius Pilate. So now let's get back to Pontius Pilate. As I mentioned earlier, he didn't actually live in Jerusalem, but in Caesarea Maritima, which is right here. It was the most important port city of its time. Essentially, goods from all over this region were shipped to Rome out of this port. Goods from all over Roman Empire were shipped back. Some of the goods that would have been sent to Rome were the famous fish of Magdalene. And in the book, you can read more about that. I'll probably also do another video about Mary Magdalene that talks about the Magdalene fish. So, Pilate didn't live in Jerusalem. He lived in Caesarea. In fact, it's a fair distance from Caesarea to Jerusalem. Even today, it's over an hour by car. Let's look at Caesarea Maritima. It was a beautiful city. This is what it looked like today, but it gives you some idea of how gorgeous this city in an idyllic location on the Mediterranean Sea must have been. This is an aqueduct that was built there to transport water. They had an amphitheater that's still in use today for musical performances and theatrical performances. Down here you see the hippodrome. This is what they had for chariot races. They had a huge market. They had Roman baths and spas. This city in its time was probably like the Miami of the Roman Empire. That's where Pontius Pilate actually lived. Now, what you're looking at up here is something called the Pilate's Stone. And if you look carefully, you'll see written and inscribed in there, it says Pilatus. And above that, it says Tiberius. It was the Emperor Tiberius who appointed Pontius Pilate to be the governor of Jerusalem. This stone was actually found kind of reused in, I think it was the amphitheater in Caesarea. Someone noticed it, noticed what was inscribed on it. It was rescued, and it's now found in the Israel Museum. We don't know what it was originally used for, but what it does provide is actual physical proof that Pontius Pilate once existed. Why was he in Jerusalem? He didn't live there, and it was quite a distance. Well, there were constant plots forming to free the Jewish people from being under the rule of the Romans. No one there was happy about the Roman occupation. They wanted to be free. They wanted their own country. And this whole idea of a Messiah, or O come, Emmanuel, that was all to have someone to free the Jewish people from the Romans. So this was constantly a concern for Pilate because as the governor, he was there to keep order and enforce Roman authority. Now, the Passover is an extremely important Jewish celebration. And at that time, Jewish people from all over the country came to Jerusalem to worship at the temple. The Passover celebrates an event that liberated the people of Israel from the Egyptians at the time of Moses. So it's sort of consistent with more fervor towards freedom and overthrowing Rome coming into play. And with so many people in the city of Jerusalem, there was potential for trouble to break out. That's why Pilate was there. And indeed, trouble did break out for Pilate. It came in a man named Jesus. What do we know about Pontius Pilate? Well, very little about his early life. Probably he ascended through the ranks of the Roman military as a young man. Finally, in 26, he was appointed governor of Judea. He was the 5th governor since the Roman occupation, and he served in that role for about 10 years till 36. So he was 7 years into his tenure when he became involved with the trial of Jesus. Now, Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, and then he was taken to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, and tried before the Sanhedrin, which is a council of Jewish elders. They found Jesus guilty of blasphemy, which was a crime that deserved death, right? However, the Sanhedrin couldn't exercise capital punishment, even if the Jewish laws required it. Only the Romans could put someone to death. That's the reason that Jesus had to have a second trial in front of Pontius Pilate. Now, we don't know much about Pilate's early life, but we do know a little bit about his early career as governor of Judea. He got off to a very bad start. Very early in his tenure, he angered the Jewish authorities because he brought busts of the Emperor Tiberius attached to military standards into Jerusalem. And this violated the Jewish law, which forbids the making of images. The Jewish authorities asked Pilate to remove the busts, and he refused. Consequently, protesters surrounded his house in Caesarea for 5 days. On the 6th day, Pilate sent in some Roman soldiers to get the crowd to disperse. They drew their swords, and to their amazement, the Jewish demonstrators bared their necks and said they'd rather die than violate the Jewish law. Pilate was impressed with the zeal of the Jewish demonstrators. Not only did he spare their lives, he ordered the busts removed. Now, when you go to this instance, the far more famous incident was the trial of Jesus. And at that time, the earlier experience with Jewish protesters must have weighed to some degree on Pilate. Pilate himself said he found no fault in Jesus. He seemed to want to let him go. But the mob cried out, no, he's violated the Jewish law and he deserves death. He has to be crucified. Now, most people believe that many of the crowdspeople that day that were crying this out were paid protesters who were placed there by Joseph Caiaphas, the high priest, and possibly some others that wanted to secure Jesus' death. The idea of paid protesters is not exactly a new thing in the 21st century. They certainly had them in the first century of Judea. Pilate, however, was undoubtedly concerned about the riot or unrest that would probably take place if he let Jesus go, because he had already seen the zeal of Jewish demonstrators who felt their laws had been violated. Consequently, he gave in to the mob and he ordered Jesus to be crucified. Let's move on to Station 5 and talk about Simon of Cyrene. This is the man who helps Jesus carry his cross. And what you see here is the actual Station 5 on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem. It's one of the most popular stations of all 14, and in a moment, I'll tell you why. Who was Simon of Cyrene? Well, he was essentially a passerby enlisted by the Roman soldiers to help Jesus carry his cross. As far as we know, he had no previous dealings with Jesus or anyone else in the Bible. In fact, the New Testament tells us that Simon had just come into Jerusalem from the country when this incident occurred. We don't know very much about him other than that he had two sons, Alexander and Rufus, and they might have been with him. If you think about this incident and put it in our modern era, it's sort of like imagining yourself getting off a flight from somewhere, coming into the city where you're either going home to or visiting, and the police say, hey, we need your help. You've got to carry the stuff for this man who's going to jail or even to an execution, and you do it. Why did Simon of Cyrene do it? Well, a Roman centurion's order was not to be disregarded in those times. It basically had the effect of law. If they enlisted you, you had to go. Although many people also believe that Simon felt sorry for Jesus and was willing to help him at that moment when he saw him in distress. Cyrene was a town in North Africa on the Mediterranean. You can see it here, and it's very close to modern-day Libya. This is the reason that Simon of Cyrene is often portrayed as a dark-skinned man. However, his actual ethnicity is not known. So let's talk about Station 5 and why it's one of the most popular stations on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem today. It's because of this. It's like a handprint in the wall, right near Station 5. What is that? Well, legend has it that that's the handprint of Jesus. The story, of course, is that Jesus is carrying his cross along the Via Dolorosa from his trial before Pilate to Calvary. Here he would have turned a corner, and he was already terribly weak from being beaten and whipped and abused. He'd already fallen at Station 3, and at this point, he reached out again and put his hand against the wall to keep himself from falling. Legend has it that that is the reason that there's a handprint in the wall at this place. And also, seeing that he was again unsteady with the cross, the Roman soldiers enlisted a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, to help Jesus by carrying his cross or helping him carry his cross to Calvary. That's why this is one of the most important stations, and people love it on the Via Dolorosa because they want to come here and put their hand right here and touch the hand of Jesus, have their photo taken, and it's really one of the most beautiful sights in Jerusalem today. Let's move on to Station 6, which is the station of Veronica, the compassionate woman who wiped the face of Jesus. Here's Station 6 on the Via Dolorosa in Jerusalem today. Veronica wiped Jesus' face or handed him her veil to wipe his face, and the image of Jesus' face was imprinted onto her veil. Now, Veronica was probably not the woman's name. This term no doubt referred to her receiving the true image of Christ on her veil, because vera is the Latin word for true, and icon is the Greek word for image. In fact, scholars today who study artifacts like this actually call the veil itself the Veronica. Now, there's currently 6 different artifacts in museums and palaces all over the world that all contend to be the actual veil of Veronica, or a true representation of it. The best known is this one here on the left. It's called the Veil of Manapella. It was rediscovered in 1999 at a Capuchin monastery in Italy, by Professor Heinrich Pfeiffer. He was a professor of Christian art at the Vatican's Gregorian University, and he contended that this veil was stolen from the Vatican in the 17th century at the time of a renovation to the area where the veil was housed and turned up later in this monastery in Manipella. What's particularly interesting about this Veronica is the material it's made of, which is byssus or sea silk. What is that? Well, if you've ever eaten mussels or cooked mussels, you've probably seen the beards or threads of the mussels that you have to take off before you cook or eat the mussels. If you imagine giant clams in the Mediterranean, they also have similar threads or beards, except they're extremely long because of the size of the clam itself. People dive for these clams and they harvest the threads or beards. They then wash them and they turn into a translucent, almost golden fabric that's woven to create sea silk or byssus. This was one of the most costly fabrics of the ancient world. It's been found in the burial of pharaohs, and it's been used in the vestments of Jewish high priests. It's so delicate that it can be dyed, but it can't be painted on, and that's what makes the Veil of Manipella so interesting. Unfortunately, however, it's also far too delicate for carbon-14 testing, and therefore, no one has ever done any analysis like that to try to age the Veil of Manipella. If this really was Veronica's veil, then one thing we know about her for sure is that she was an extremely wealthy woman if she had a veil of byssus. But who exactly was Veronica? Well, that too is a mystery. Now, her name probably wasn't Veronica. So what was it? Some people believe that she was the woman with the hemorrhage who was healed when she touched the hem of Jesus' robe in the marketplace years earlier. Perhaps she was in Jerusalem for the Passover, saw Jesus in distress, and offered him this act of kindness because he had healed her and changed her life earlier in her life. So that's one theory. Some believe it was Mary Magdalene who wiped the face of Jesus. Without a doubt, Mary Magdalene was there. Mary Magdalene is placed at the crucifixion by all four of the gospel writers, and it is very unlikely that she just showed up at Calvary. Knowing Mary Magdalene, she was a persistent woman, and she was undoubtedly right outside the Praetorium and followed Jesus all the way through. So was that possible? Of course it was. Personally, I'd like to believe that Veronica, whoever she was a stranger who didn't know Jesus or who he was, simply a compassionate woman moved to offer a random act of kindness that day. This illustrates the power of small acts of kindness in our daily lives, because what Veronica did that day for Jesus was a simple act that's now been remembered for 2,000 years. In the book, Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross, every station has reflections and prayers. They've been designed to call out what are the lessons of some of these stations and allow people to relate to those and really look at some of the best parts of themselves in thinking about these issues. Let me read to you the one for Station 6 on the Via Dolorosa. Like Veronica, let me find ways to offer small acts of kindness throughout my day, never knowing what their impact might truly be. Even for a moment, let me bring compassion and warmth to those in difficulty who cross my path. Let's move on now and talk about Joseph of Arimathea, the man who arranges Jesus' burial. What you see here on the right is Station 14, the final stations, which is the tomb of Jesus. It's located in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And if you've never seen it before, it probably isn't what you imagined the tomb of Jesus actually looked like when you thought about it. We'll talk more about Station 14 and the fact that there's actually two sites in Jerusalem that are known as Jesus' tomb, and I'll show you both. Joseph of Arimathea was a rich and prominent man. He was a member of the Sanhedrin. Luke indicated that he was part of the Council of Elders, but he had not consented to what the others planned and carried out, namely the arrest, trial, and execution of Jesus. Joseph went to Pontius Pilate to obtain Jesus' body after the crucifixion. Now, the typical practice in those days, if a criminal was executed by crucifixion, the body was typically thrown into a pit or a common grave. That person was not given the privilege of a private burial. So Joseph had to go to Pilate and get the body in order to give Jesus a proper burial. He arranged for Jesus' burial himself in a tomb that he either owned or had purchased specifically for this purpose. And what's interesting in the Bible is they refer to it numerous times as a new tomb in which no one had been laid. That may seem a little odd to us in the 21st century, but in the first century, they had a practice where they put someone in a tomb, and then after a period of time, maybe a year, maybe however many months, they would come back after the flesh had decayed from the body. They would take the bones and they would put the bones in something called an ossuary and bury that. So this is this whole idea of a new tomb in which no one had been laid. In fact, tombs were sometimes repurposed in those days. The most interesting, well, maybe not the most interesting, but an interesting theory about Joseph of Arimathea is that he might have been Jesus' uncle. Where does that idea come from? Well, it stems from the Jewish custom requiring that the nearest male relative of a deceased person is responsible for their burial. Mary's husband, Joseph, no longer appears to be living by the time of Jesus' ministry. He's not mentioned, for example, in the wedding at Cana. Jesus is there with his mother. His father's never mentioned, so he's probably deceased by that point. To obtain Pilate's permission to give Jesus a private burial, many people believe that Joseph of Arimathea would have had to demonstrate a claim to the body that was consistent with Jewish law. This is why many scholars believe that Joseph may have either been the Virgin Mary's older brother or her uncle, and therefore Jesus' great uncle. Others, however, believe that Pilate may have already regretted putting Jesus to death, and a request from a prominent member of the community to give him a proper burial may not have met with much resistance. But those who believe the theory that Joseph of Arimathea may have been Jesus' uncle typically also believe one of many legends about Joseph of Arimathea. That is, that he brought Jesus with him to Cornwall, England, when he was a teenager or a young man. Now, what's that story about and how did it develop? Joseph of Arimathea was clearly a wealthy man, and his wealth was thought to be derived from international trade, including trade in minerals such as tin and copper. At the time, one of the most famous tin mines in the world was in Cornwall, in England. And some believe that perhaps if Jesus' father, Joseph, was dead, Joseph of Arimathea might have taken Jesus with him as a teenager or a young man on some of his trips. This was the inspiration for William Blake's poem that became the popular British hymn, Jerusalem. It starts, "And did those feet in ancient time walk upon England's mountains green, and was the Holy Lamb of God on England's pleasant pasture seen?" Joseph of Arimathea, however, is a man of many legends, and the most popular, of course, is the Holy Grail. Now, this is a medieval legend that claims that Joseph of Arimathea arrived in Glastonbury, England after the crucifixion, bringing with him the cup that Jesus drank from at the Last Supper, into which he had collected the drops of Jesus' blood when he hung on the cross at the crucifixion. Kind of grisly, but that was the theory. Now, this legend largely emerged in the 12th and 13th centuries. It doesn't appear to have a lot of validity. That said, if you Google it, you will find articles by British scholars that appear on a pretty regular basis, claiming that there is in fact good authority for this legend's validity. And it's an interesting one. What's the most interesting about it, however, is that it has become the cornerstone of all the Arthurian legends about the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail. Even Indiana Jones went looking for it at the end of the 20th century. So that again is the foundation. Joseph of Arimathea, someone in the Stations of the Cross, is actually the foundation for the legend of the Holy Grail. let's get back to this issue about why there's two different sites for Jesus' tomb. This is station 14 in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. By all accounts, this is probably the right location of Jesus' tomb. As you'll see, it doesn't look like much like what you probably imagined it was going to appear to be. You can't really think of Joseph and Nicodemus rolling the boulder across, or Mary Magdalene standing right in front of it on Easter morning. But that doesn't mean it isn't accurate. However, in the late 19th century, a British general who was stationed in Jerusalem noticed that there was a hill in East Jerusalem which in certain light sort of looked like a skull. And of course, Calvary itself is supposed to be the place of the skull, either Golgotha or Calvary. And so he started to wonder if maybe that hill was Calvary and not the traditional site in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And indeed, a whole group of rock-hewn tombs was found in the area, including this one. This today is the Garden Tomb in East Jerusalem. And it's a very popular site for Christian pilgrims and others visiting Jerusalem, because when you look at this site, of course, it immediately evokes the events of the burial and the resurrection. You can almost imagine Mary Magdalene just standing there talking to Jesus, who she thinks is the gardener. There's only one problem with the Garden Tomb. Archaeologists have dated it to about 700 BC. It's far too old to have been the burial site of Jesus, particularly if Jesus was buried, as the Bible tells us, in a new tomb in which no one had yet been laid. That concludes my presentation on 4 people in the Stations of the Cross, and I'd like to thank you for joining me. If you like this webinar, you'll love the book. Mary Magdalene's Stations of the Cross is now available on Amazon, Apple iBooks, and all major book platforms. It comes in an ebook or Kindle format, a paperback, and a hardcover. If you'd like to get in touch, please drop me an email at ann@annregimbal.com or visit my website, annregimbal.com. Thank you so much and have a beautiful Easter.